I'm with Jonathan Feldstein, and we're talking about trouble here in the land. What's happening at the moment?
So we've got, in the last couple of days, things have been unusually tense. We've been having a particularly large number of rockets being fired from Gaza, from our neighbors there at southern Israel so far. A few days ago, I don't remember which day it was, we had a rocket land south of here in the Negev area, not too far from the Dimona nuclear reactor that was launched as an anti-aircraft missile all the way from Syria. That's been very alarming. And there's been a growing, frustrating trend, and it's become cyclical, of Arabs in Israel, the Palestinian and Israeli Arabs, assaulting Israeli Jews and filming it to put on TikTok and perhaps other social media, which has become cyclical. But then, of course, unfortunately, the response to that has been a lot of Israeli Jews protesting, assaulting Arabs, and yelling death to Arabs. And we're in a very tense and unpleasant situation here right now.
Have they been putting these things on TikTok because they want to put something on social media, or is it hatred that's running this?
Oh, I think it's hatred, and I'm not a Muslim, so I don't know, but if someone were to kind of research it and plot it out, I think the fact that we're in the middle of Ramadan probably is exacerbating things, whether because people are hungry and cranky, or it's hot out, or it's maybe just how one behaves spiritually during Ramadan. I don't know. I'm not suggesting that about all of Islam, but here it seems to me that when Ramadan comes, we end up having a higher proportion of problems like this. So there's obviously hatred. You don't do such a thing. First of all, you don't go around in the streets assaulting people just because. That's an absurd behavior, much less than filming it and celebrating it and putting it on the internet, on any social media. So it's not out of love, it's out of hate, it's probably a way of somehow perversely expressing one's dominance over Israel, but it's not really serving any positive effort.
Now we've also had riots on the streets of Jerusalem. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so there have been riots of, typically, as I understand, it's been happening after evening prayers from Ramadan, is that the Palestinian Arabs in Jerusalem are looking for targets and are encountered by police who push them back and restrain them. And conversely, Israeli Jews, typically more right-wing, I don't want to suggest that necessarily on either side it's a trend among the entire populations, but it's become very divisive also at a political season when Israel is trying to form a government and political voices tend to be somewhat polarized, and where there's the possibility that in a few weeks there may be a Palestinian Authority election. None of it can be devoid of the political overtones and the season in which we're existing.
How do these rockets that have been fired from Gaza affect the people in the communities around the Gaza Belt?
Oh, it's horrible. I mean, I don't know if it's worse when you're living in a situation where on a daily basis for an extended period that you're getting rockets or the threat of rockets, or if it's having lived through a period of relative calm and now the last 3 or 4 days, every night there are rockets, but that's been very difficult and damaging. Kids are afraid to go out of the house. Kids are afraid to go to school. Parents don't want to leave their kids. For any number of reasons, it creates a lot of PTSD because anyone who's old enough to remember when this happened before, it's creating trauma, reliving that it might go on and create more threats or loss of life.
We've already mentioned about the missile attack from Syria. How serious was this? And could this have actually hit the nuclear plant and caused huge disaster here?
Well, just by asking the question, it got my heart racing. I suppose could have. The fact that a missile as big and as armed as it was made it as far as it did is a sign that I hope that, well, maybe that was deliberate. Maybe maybe someone calculated the trajectory and it was sort of left alone, although I understand Patriot missiles were fired at it in order to take it out, and the questions as to why Israel used the Patriot missile, which has relatively moderate success rate as compared to some of the other Israeli systems that have been developed. That could have been disastrous. Even if the rocket itself hadn't struck a direct hit on any target, whether it be the nuclear reactor or my home or another city, if the rocket had been blown up in midair and debris fell on an apartment building like mine and went through a number of floors and created damage. We could be just as well sitting right now in the midst of a war.
We're also seeing tension at the moment between Iran and shipping. Tell us about that.
Right. Well, there's been now for some weeks, it seems like a tit for tat. The Iranians continue to target Israeli commercial vessels in the Red Sea and in the Gulf of Oman. And Israel, it seems, is retaliating by not commercial vessels, but by attacking Iranian military vessels that are out in the high seas. And it's not just that, but 2 weeks ago, there was a huge explosion at the underground Natanz nuclear facility, which is blamed on Israel. It's perhaps reasonably intuitive that Israel had something to do with that, but that apparently caused a great deal of damage. And Iran has to either suck up the loss or save face and respond somehow that they can claim that they have retaliated. And I don't think that story is over yet. And as we speak, a very high-level Israeli delegation, a security and military delegation, is visiting Washington to try and, I think, implore upon the United States that a return to the same Iran deal of 2015, which simply delayed the Iranian ability to create nuclear weapons and in fact, some say paved the path for that, is not a deal that Israel can allow to go back to. And in fact, I just published an article about that came out today. The Iran story is yet finished, and it's unclear where that's going to go yet.
With riots on the street in Jerusalem, do you fear a third Intifada?
Again, the wrong thing happening could trigger something like that. Ramadan doesn't help, I don't think. We have about a week and a half to go of Ramadan. If one person gets severely hurt or, God forbid, killed, Jew or Arab, that will very likely trigger a much more hostile response from others. And we could see there was a fear, and there still probably is a fear, of lone wolf terror attacks. I think because we are potentially weeks away from an election for the Palestinian Authority Parliament, you could see any political or terrorist group among the Palestinians begin to use violence and terror as a political tactic to gain influence, which is, it's a really horrible way to go. In America, there used to be a political campaign phrase, a chicken in every pot. God willing that our neighbors would campaign on giving people food and prosperity rather than trying to kill Israelis.
Do you fear war at the moment? Situations in Gaza with the rockets and, of course, with Iran as well. We've just spoken about that. Do you fear that we could be going to war soon?
It's a very good question. Someone asked me that yesterday. I don't fear that war is any more imminent today than it was yesterday or a week ago or a month ago. But with more open violence, all it takes is for one rocket from Gaza to break through the Israeli Iron Dome system and hit a house or a school or a community center or a commercial area and have lots of Israeli casualties, and Israel will be forced to respond, and that response will necessarily incur civilian casualties on the other side. And I can't speak for everybody. I don't think most Israelis want that. I'm hopeful that most Palestinian Arabs don't want that. I surely don't want that. But if something like that were to happen, or a rocket from Lebanon or from Syria, or a major terror attack, you can possibly risk seeing things that spiral out of control and become a war. And I hope not.
We've talked about rockets coming from Gaza. How does Israel respond to that? What's the Iron Dome? What does it do?
Good question. The Iron Dome is an Israeli-developed system that tracks from the moment a rocket is fired. It was created to respond to the Gaza threat, but it's used in other situations as well. And it's typically short range. I couldn't tell you exactly how many kilometers, I don't recall, but we're not talking about tens of kilometers. We're talking about relatively short range. It tracks, it follows the trajectory and will project where the rocket will hit. And instantaneously, if the rocket is projected to hit in a developed area and risk civilian casualties, then there's a countermeasure that's fired, and the Gaza terrorist rocket is typically blown out of the air, and there's about an 80% success rate, as I understand, as far as knocking them out. Fortunately, there have not been lots of casualties, and fortunately, Israel's been able to develop this, because the irony in that, Paul, is that the Iron Dome obviously protects Israelis, but it's also protecting Palestinian Arabs in Gaza because, as I said before, in a different context, if, God forbid, one of those rockets were to get through and actually cause major damage, Israel would be left with no alternative but to fire back and in a potentially punishing way that will hurt any number of Palestinian Arabs living in Gaza because the terrorists use civilian infrastructure for cover for their rocket launching.
When they fire a rocket from Gaza, do they have any sense of accuracy, or is it just basically firing it and hit and miss wherever it lands, it lands?
As I understand, the rockets from Gaza are pretty unsophisticated and don't have a great deal of accuracy. The range varies. I've seen some of them. They've probably gotten more sophisticated over the years. But basically, they point and shoot, and they aim toward populated areas, obviously. So the largest Israeli town that's near the Gaza border is Sderot. Sderot would be hit, used to be a decade or so ago, would be hit on a regular basis or attacked before the Iron Dome, and there's an air raid siren that you end up having all of about 15, 20 seconds to get cover when you hear the air raid siren. Now, good for Sderot, but bad for communities further away from the Gaza border, the rockets have longer range. So Sderot is not the only city that's getting fired at or where this air raid siren is being sounded on a regular basis. But in fact, large cities of 100 or 150, 200,000 people.
Can a rocket from Gaza actually hit Jerusalem?
A rocket from Gaza can definitely hit Jerusalem, and I wish we had pictures to show people here, and I don't know the exact distance, but I always forget what year it was, 2014 or 16, when we had some increasing level of hostility and a lot of rockets coming out. So on a Saturday afternoon here in central Gush Etzion, there was a air raid siren. I was in my house. I looked out the window. I saw it was kind of entertaining, as perverse as it was. I saw people scattering in every direction to run home to get cover in their bomb shelters. And then we heard two explosions. The rocket hit. It landed across the valley from my home on the top of a mountain, and the reverberation, we believe that there was just one explosion, which burned for several hours afterward. So there are pictures of this. And the reverberation, because we're in a mountainous area that's largely stone, it felt like there was a second rocket. There were two. The impact had a double explosive kind of impact, so the house shook twice. And I once met one of the developers of the Iron Dome, and I explained that scenario. And I remember how I just explained that the rocket, the Iron Dome, will track the trajectory and identify whether the rocket's going to hit in a developed or undeveloped area. That rocket landed probably 200 meters from my home, from my neighborhood, on an empty mountaintop. And I said to this guy who developed the Iron Dome, I said, was that part of it, or was that just a mistake? And he didn't want to answer. But it was very unnerving to have a rocket go that far and hit right outside your front door.
What's your prayer for Israel and the Palestinians at this time?
The first prayer for Israel and the Palestinians is that we rewind and don't get into a situation where there's going to be regret and loss of life on both sides. And I pray that somehow through our election, which has yet to be played out, and through the Palestinian election, which may or may not happen, that we will have leaders who have the wisdom to bring us toward more coexistence, if not peace, and everyone can thrive and coexist prosperously.
Okay, Jonathan, thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul. It's a pleasure.